Good morning, my dear humans, and welcome to a new episode of Psicoactivo. When I started this channel about over a year ago, I, amongst the many figures that I started studying and looking at the work that they do related to the study of the phenomenon or phenomenology, one of the people that I wanted to speak the most, I'm getting to talk to today, finally. And it's a like a full circle kind of moment for me. So I'm very honored and very excited to present to you Dr. Jeffrey Kripal, professor of religious studies at Rice University. And I speak about the universal language quite a bit. I think if anybody would be a universal linguist, it would be him. So welcome, Professor. How are you, sir?
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's start with just like your overall body of work has to do mostly with studying human potential, which for Psicoactivo, this is like right up my alley. You have books such as um, How to Think Impossibly, The Superhumanities. You have another one that really excites me about mutants and mystics. And I grew up watching the X-Men. So I want to ask you about what's going on right now, because seemingly psionics is now a word that is part of the vocabulary.
Yeah.
And making these parallels between the mutants and the fantastical kind of abilities that they have and what people seem to perceive as gifts, precognition, levitation, and all these telepathy. Um, how much do you study these aspects, and what do you consider them gifts, or do you consider them another part of human evolution? What's your take on that? Because I'm really interested.
That's a big question. So I wrote this book in 2007 called Esalen, America and the Religion of No Religion. And it was really on the human potential movement in California now in the 60s and 70s. And the ideas that were coming out of that human potential movement were essentially that extraordinary abilities are part of our natural inheritance, and that these are evolutionary buds, essentially. These are signs of our future evolution. So things like a precognitive dream or a telepathic communication or a near-death experience, that these were all essentially signs of where we're going. And this was obviously a kind of post-Darwinian, really not a Darwinian, but a more Sri Aurobindo, more Teilhard de Chardin, more of a kind of spiritual evolution that was driving the species forward. When I finished that book. That book came out in '07, and I became obsessed with my childhood with the X-Men, actually. Um, I thought it was okay. I'm having a midlife regression or something. I don't know. Um, um, but I listened to it, and I'm listened to it in the terms of paid attention to it, and I realized that a lot of the human potential ideas, particularly around evolution, were essentially identical to the X-Men mythology. And the X-Men mythology developed on the East Coast in the New York area about the same time as these human potential movements were birthed in the early 60s. And so I began to suspect some kind of resonance between human potential ideas and the X-Men mythology. And of course, the X-Men, I read comics as a kid in the 60s and 70s. They were they were not so good, Pavel. I mean, it was sort of a B or C class kind of comic book, and they were reinvented in '75, and that's really what we know as the X-Men today. And they took off in '75 then. And but but the basic point of a lot of my work is that the superpowers are real, that human beings have them. Um, they're part of our nature, our evolutionary nature. I complicate that again. It's not that I think that people are walking around in spandex and
Yeah.
we have control of these things because most people don't have any control of them. They happen spontaneously. People suffer them, as I like to
Yeah.
say. There's a real role for trauma here. But these things definitely happen. And it turns out that the X-Men mythology, the writers and the artists were drawing on this long history of mostly parapsychology and religious transformation. So I see the X-Men as a kind of modern myth or mythology that encodes these deeper kind of religious or spiritual components that have been with the species for as far as we can see back, actually.
Yeah.
Uh,
I wanted to ask you though, because you speak about spirituality and with the conversation as it is right now, with the phenomenon, it seems to me, I heard recently Dr. or Professor Diana Pasolka talking about that she believes right now that this phenomenon could be related to some kind of angels and demons taxonomy. And there's a lot of reticence when you hear things like that amongst people in today's world because there's a lot of judgment against organized religion, and they confuse religion or religious devotion with spirituality. What's the difference between the two, according to you?
it's tough. I mean, those are words, right? Those are just English words. The birth of what we think of as spirituality is a very modern, kind of late 19th, 20th century phenomenon. And it really refers, it first appears in Walt Whitman, by the way, and refers to this orientation in the world that is not rooted in affiliation with any particular religious tradition, but nevertheless sees some kind of cosmic meaning or purpose in the universe. So it's an attempt to get away, I suppose, from traditional religion, but to still be oriented towards the cosmos and towards consciousness in some way. So it's not a perfect word, Pavel. I'm not attached to it. If someone can come up with a better word, all the more power to them. Religion's a conversation killer, by the way. If you want to
Yeah,
if you want to destroy a conversation or have someone turn away, just use the word religion, and they'll usually turn away. Um, so I don't I speak in terms of the superhuman, because first of all, that word itself is rooted in the humanities and in the history of philosophy, but also it refers to this idea that human beings experience altered states that are above them or beyond them, and they're invaded, as it were, by these states. Now, if I can just say one more thing, in terms of the demons and the angels, that's the language of our ancestors.
yeah.
That's how our ancestors understood this, and it's still how a lot of people understand it, of course, today. I think it's mistaken. Um, I worry about that. I mean, this notion that there are invisible entities is an old idea, but I worry about how quickly we come to judge them. And the reason I worry about that is because people who have these experiences, it doesn't fit into those binary either or categories. It just
Yeah,
doesn't.
yeah.
Um, and so I want to think with and support the experiencers. And so I'm deeply conflicted about the demonic and the angelic language because it's just too quick, it's too easy, it's too much of the past, and I just think it's often mistaken.
I was talking to someone who Nick Cook,
Oh yeah,
author,
sure. Yeah.
and he seems to also fall in this belief that he's on the side of the angels, and that really surprised me because it happened when I was just starting on this, which is a little over a year, and that really puzzled me and still puzzles me today. And now it seems like it's more prevalent between amongst people who are like at the top investigating this. Professor Pasolka is one of them, and that's why I wanted to ask you though. It's interesting to hear your perspective for
Yeah, I mean,
sure.
I don't know what Nick means by being on the side of the angels or what Diana means. I mean, I have a sense. I think all of us think you know, we're driven or we're called to do something, and I'm sure we are. Um, but I'm much more happier with the angelic language than the demonic language, Pavel.
Yeah,
I think angelic language, it acknowledges the positive kind of um, and mysterious, uncanny quality of what is happening. but the demonic language just it resists it and pushes it into the corner. And I think that's wrong, and I think it's morally wrong, and it's also frankly dangerous because I think these things are appearing for a reason, not to just do bad things.
Yeah, I agree with you. When I speak about you being a universal linguist, one of the reasons I say that is because you leave everything on the table and you don't want to take anything off the table. And
No.
I find that completely necessary in today's climate. So I wanted to ask you another aspect of Esalen, it's called
Oh,
Institute.
Esalen. Esalen.
Esalen, because when Jake Barber came forward, he spoke about being at that institute, and they made some sort of like a summit where they showcased some of these skills. They did this contact with these orbs. I know you're a very busy man and you're like at Rice. Surely you weren't there, but what goes on there? If you could like explain a little bit to the
Yeah.
people, because there's a lot of questions about this place that was just mentioned.
Yeah. So first of all, I wasn't there, and I can't speak to that event or seminar. I just wasn't there.
Yeah.
But I wrote the history of the place, and so
Yeah.
I know a lot about the institute itself. Um, Basically, it was founded not originally as Esalen, that came a little later, but it was founded in 1962. And what it was founded to do was take seriously a set of human capacities or abilities and think about them and talk about them and write about them. And there wasn't there wasn't the pretense that we understand these things or that there's some one model or one belief system. It was rather, let's have a multi-decade long conversation, about these abilities. And the other reason that the Institute was formed was to experiment with practices that put these potentials into actuality. In other words, that actualize the potentials, to use the language of Aldous Huxley and Abraham Maslow. So this seminar that Jake is talking about, it sounds to me like there was an emphasis on practice and actualizing whatever these human potentials were. Um, and that's very faithful to Esalen. I mean, that's what that's what a lot of seminars do there. But there are hundreds and hundreds of seminars every year, and I mean, there's probably been close over a million, well over a million. I mean, there was probably 14, 15,000 people going through there before the
Whoa.
pandemic every year. So you can just do the math. I mean, it's been around for 63, we're going on 63 years now. And um, it certainly can't, Esalen cannot be identified with any of the practices or seminars that take place there. It's a place to experiment though, and to
Yeah.
explore into these regions for sure.
And this completely dispels, in my opinion, rumors that only people that are like, because the rumor about the hybrids, quote unquote,
Yeah.
that they have these abilities. I think it's everybody. It's just
Yeah.
like a skill, like basketball, that some are more gifted and others need to get there, through practice. Do you concur there?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, the language of the hybrid, everybody's a hybrid. I mean, human beings are amphibious. I mean, we've been hybrids as far as we can see back. Now, that's a modern genetic language that I still think is probably a metaphor. Um, I think everyone has these potentials, Pavel. That doesn't mean everybody can actualize these skills. When I was, as I joke, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an NFL quarterback, and guess what? That didn't happen. Um, and guess why it didn't happen? Because I didn't have the skills. I didn't have the genetic. I mean, so skills are not evenly distributed, regardless of what people wish. They're just not. They're not evenly distributed in the species. And I think something like precognition or certainly telekinesis or summoning UFOs even, um they're not evenly distributed, and some people are just gifted or special. um and I think historically our ancestors identified those special people as the saints or shamans or religious specialists of their community. And today we don't even have a category because at least in the States we live in a very secular kind of civilization or society.
Yeah. Well, Jake Barber did mention that there are some triggers that kind of activate, quote unquote, these skills.
Yeah,
I
there
had
are.
I had an experience close to death in 2014. So a lot of things changed in my life after that happened. Uh, what other triggers can you find that uh, could activate this or maybe
I mean,
make
I
it
think
more?
first of all, I think people are just different. Some
Yeah.
people are set up for this, but for most people, it requires some kind of trauma. Um, so, for example, take a near-death experience. You know, a near-death experience by definition is traumatic. I mean, you almost die, or you do die. And then when the person comes back, often what we see is that they're endowed with particular abilities that confuse them, by the way. They find deeply problematic on a lot of ways. I think a psychedelic or psychoactive substance is traumatizing essentially to the chemistry of the brain. I think a lot of religious practice historically is about suppressing cognitive, function, meditation, contemplation. These are all ways of essentially shutting down cognitive capacity so that other forms of reality can come in, so that the person can have access to these other dimensions. So I would just say trauma, you know,
Okay.
and that could be physical trauma, it could be emotional trauma, it could be sexual trauma, and trauma doesn't necessarily lead to these particular gifts, you know. It can just be purely destructive. I don't want to romanticize or idealize suffering,
Yeah.
but suffering and the paranormal often go together. And I've seen that. The reason I say that is I've just seen it so many times, Pavel, that it's hard to deny that. It just seems kind of obvious.
Yeah, it does. I agree. Um, I wanted to ask you though, because I've been researching a lot of people that have studied this over the decades during this last year. And one name that keeps coming up with these topics of human potential is Dr. Andrija Puharich.
Uh-huh.
And uh, there seems to be like this, um, they kind of ignore his name when it's like people try to talk about him in public settings. I felt maybe it's just my imagination, but uh, if that's the case, why would you think that is? Because I think he's very important for the study of parapsychology and all of these skills, and yet he's not really mentioned almost never.
Well, maybe not in what you're reading or the public conversation, Pavel, but he's certainly an important figure in the history of the field. Um, I think I mean, there is scholarship on him. There are books on him. He is mentioned, but not. It's true, not as much. And I don't know the answer to that. To be honest, I just don't know. Um, I just don't have. I don't have a reason. I mean, I don't know, Pablo.
Okay. Um, I wanted to ask you also about deities because right now we got Mr. Chris Bledsoe talking about this lady that seems to have different names throughout history. And then there's also this uh mention of ancient gods and
Yeah.
how they've also changed their name over time.
Yeah.
Do you think they're like essentially the same figures, or could they be different? Or what do you think about all of that?
That's the $60 million question right there.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a comparativist, so I compare religions and cultures, and certainly different cultures and communities have different deities. And polytheism, or this, the belief that there are many deities or many gods, was a way that people understood other communities and other traditions. So say, oh, so and so has a deity that's in charge of, say, fertility and procreation, but well, so do we, and it's the same deity. It's just different names. So that kind of comparison, that kind of polytheistic comparison, is an ancient method. What monotheism did is it inserted this one God into not the mix, but and pushed aside all of the other deities as non-existent or as lower. Um, so I do think there's a theological. What I'm trying to say is there's a theological clash here between a kind of monotheistic or a theistic theology and a polytheistic theology. Um, I don't want to take a side there because I think they both speak to human experience in a way that is quite powerful, actually. I think a lot of the UFO stuff that you're referring to, I think is very polytheistic, frankly. And
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons we have such a hard time with it is monotheism has had a very contentious history with polytheism and has generally rejected it, if not violently opposed it.
Yeah.
So
Historically.
we are inheritors of, and by we, I mean people in Western culture, people who indebted to Europe in some way are inheritors to both a kind of monotheism, but also to this deeper and more ancient polytheism.
And what about this lady though? Because
Well,
there's
that's a good example. I mean, what about the lady? What about Chris's
she's
lady?
been seen so many times. It's so wild and
Well,
making predictions and all this stuff.
I grew up Catholic and Roman Catholic, and um, the Marian apparitions were a big part of that. And there too, you have a lady that is appearing mostly to children, by the way. Um, so the deities or divine beings often appear in feminine form. That's not unusual at all. Um, but that again conflicts with this monotheistic masculinity that has really kind of taken center stage in Europe and North America, at least. But the feminine is always pushing up because over half the species is female, and once you start talking about reincarnation, and I mean you and I were women in a previous life, and so it's gender is fluid here, and it moves, and certainly with deities gender is a very fluid thing, very um confusing thing for those people who think in binaries, and it's either this or that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I
Hmm.
wanted to ask you about psychedelics because
Yeah.
I don't know how much experience you have with them. It's one of the main topics that I try to address and on my channel because
Obviously, you're the name of your show.
yeah, I believe that psychedelics could be one of the tools that may help us get to that next stage. And although I do advise that they're not for everyone and that they should be taken very seriously and with a lot of respect, I do want to get your take if you've had any experience with them. What do you think about them? Do you feel the same way or do you feel differently?
Yeah, I mean, so I've had a little experience, for sure. I've written a ton about them, both in the Esalen book um, and later on. And I interact constantly with people in the psychedelic renaissance, both researchers and experiencers. So I think psychedelic states are really, really important. I've interacted with people who are doing philosophy out of them, who are doing history out of them. I think human beings have sought out these states, again, as far as we can see back. I think psychoactive plants have been used by human beings forever, you know? And I think the modern use of psychedelics it certainly comes after what we call the drug war up north, and, a kind of um, criminalization basically of particular plants and particular substances. So it's wrought. The subject is wrought in those legal histories. Um, but I also think it's just obvious. I mean,
Yeah.
uh, I'll tell you a story. I mean, this is online. It's easily accessible. I mean, it's one of the most beautiful essays I've seen. It's called "How Magic Mushrooms Cured Me of My Atheism." and it's by a woman named Rachel Peterson. And basically, what Rachel does is she enters this clinical trial at Johns Hopkins University for clinical depression, and she experiences God.
Yeah.
You know, the beneficent source of the entire universe. And I asked Rachel, you know, explicitly, I said, well, did it cure you of your depression? And she said no, but it showed me that the depression is just one room in this much larger house that I exist in. And of course, that's a metaphor, but I think that's what psychedelic states can do is they can open the aperture, as it were, and show you more of reality and make whatever problems you're going through look less, because they are
Yeah.
less. They are
The
less.
the mushroom told me about this universal language. It taught me that. And since then I've taken it to heart, you know? It's like, and it's about empathy and about trying to laugh, trying to love, you know. It's the basic universal concepts.
I mean, I could tell you so much here, Pavel. I mean, the human potential movement, by the way, begins in some ways with Aldous Huxley. And Huxley, of course, wrote The Doors of Perception, which becomes the kind of guidebook of the counterculture. And essentially, what Huxley does in the book is he starts to entertain. Well, he begins with this idea that taking mescaline is going to produce a lot of pictures in his head. He's going to have a lot of visionary experiences, and it didn't do that at all. It opened him up to a kind of mystical experience of reality as it really is. And so he really shifts his view in the book between a production model of the brain and a filter model. And by that I mean he recognizes that the human organism, the brain and the body, are filters of reality. They're not actually, the brain doesn't actually produce consciousness, it actually filters it or translates it. And so there are deep philosophical questions embedded in these states, is what I'm trying to say. Um, I hope I'm answering your question.
No, you
I
are.
I do think that. And the mushrooms who spoke of the universal language. I mean, one of the reason I'm smiling is one of the people I talked about a lot in the book was Terence McKenna, who was a beloved teacher at Esalen. I mean, Esalen was really his spiritual home. And he starts out saying, well, the mushrooms are mediating this alien presence. And then he shifts and he says, no, wait a minute. I think mushrooms are aliens. They literally were cosmic spores that colonized the planet. And then they merge with this monkey, that becomes this human being. And then boof, here we are. Talk about hybrid. We are essentially hybrids of magic mushrooms and monkeys, basically, in
Yeah.
Terence's view. And I laugh at that theory in a supportive way. It's who can prove that? I don't know how you'd prove that, but it's so plausible and so delicious. You could see these monkeys popping everything that they find on the ground, and suddenly they pop a magic mushroom. Boom! There's consciousness.
Yeah. That seemed like to be a fly on the wall when that happened, right?
Yeah, millions of years ago.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that precisely because with DMT, I know they're mapping some kind of a place
Yeah,
at London, Imperial London College. And Dr. Pasolka talked about the use of psychedelics as a way to potentially not only communicate, but open certain portals. Could be, you could name them that.
yeah.
Um, do you think that's possible that these substances could be um, a way to open uh, other places? Yeah.
You mean in the sense of a kind of exploratory kind of yeah. I think what they're actually doing is they're revealing the nature of consciousness to us, which I think is really confusing to particularly the scientific method. The scientific method is really a third order kind of objective view of things, and it's not this internal subjective state. It's not this psychedelic state. So I think the complexity or the paradox of psychedelic science is that you have a third order method looking at a first order experience. Um, and so the question of exploration, I do think, of course, that psychedelics can be used to explore consciousness, but I don't know what that realm is. I mean, I don't claim to be able to understand what that is, particularly with language and reason and science, because I think it's inherently not dualistic like those methods are.
Okay. I want
I don't
to.
know. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yes, it
I mean,
does.
I think it makes it's and it's not an anti-scientific position. I love science. I just know that science can do certain things and come to certain kinds of knowledges, and they're not this direct experience. They
I
just
do
aren't.
wanna. I do wanna follow up on that because you mentioned the scientific method, and there seems to be like a confrontation right now between materialism and idealism, and the
Right.
scientific method is right in the middle. And there's a lot of people that really snap at you when you say that the scientific method really can't explain
It
everything,
can't. It cannot.
and they think it should.
Well,
And like,
that's their belief system.
yeah,
That's their worldview, which they're identifying with. And no worldview is complete, Pavel. They're just wrong, and they're committed to that particular worldview. But so are evangelical Christians, so are devotional Hindus, so are Buddhists, various varieties. I mean, everybody's committed to their worldview, none of which are capable. And the thing about science is that it has a kind of universalism, and it can do a lot of things. It can build refrigerators and cars and bombs and all kinds of things regardless of the place and time. And so it's a very powerful pragmatic method, but it's really bad at saying what something is. It's really good at saying how it works, and particularly how the material world works, but it's really bad at telling you what that material world is.
yeah,
Um, it
and
cannot do that because of that scientific method, and that's not a criticism. It's just an acknowledgement of what the scientific method is.
it's what our good friend Dr. Alex Gomez Marin calls scientism, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah. Um,
I mean, I think the people who are offended and angry are in that scientism worldview. And we're just like, okay, whatever. But that's just not true.
yeah. By the way, I want to thank Alex for making this happen. He was the
Oh,
one who made the connection, and I love how the way he sees the world. It's very similar to what we're talking about right now.
yeah.
And I see him because he's a theoretical physicist. I see him like right in the middle too, trying to like explore one side while trying to stay true to the other side where he with which he grew up. And it's a never ending struggle, really. I want to ask you about that though, because there seems to be this movement right now of disclosure, right? But if we want full disclosure as people see it, they call it catastrophic,
Yeah.
because catastrophic means that we're going to leave the materialistic paradigm behind us. And there seems to be this group of people that don't really want that. They just want to transform capitalism and keep the materialistic paradigm while also trying to explain these unexplainable things. What do you think should happen, or what do you think the best possible route could be?
Well, I don't think we're going to abandon materialism or science or anything like that. I think those are all false fears. Um, I think keeping everything on the table means also keeping those methods that work on the table. Um, but as soon as you start to take somebody's extraordinary psychedelic state or near-death state or whatever the experience is, I think you do have to add something to on top of or beside that worldview. And that's really what I'm really just calling for a conversation, Pavel, or a multi-generational conversation. We're not going to figure this one out, at least in my generation. We're not going to do it. but we can have a conversation. And I do think that the certainty and the completeness of that materialist or physicalist worldview is on the defensive now. But that doesn't mean it's wrong, Pavel. That means there's a big difference between being wrong and being inadequate.
Yeah.
I think scientism is not wrong. I think it's absolutely right, but it is not adequate to explaining the human condition or the human experience. I think you need something else to even address that.
That's why conversations like the one you had with Michael Shermer are
Yeah,
very important. I really
yeah,
love that conversation
yeah,
because you guys were always respectful and you express your ideas each side.
yeah.
Uh, we need more of that, I think.
I listen. I've literally spent months sitting with physicists and neuroscientists and geneticists. I Scientists are wonderful. I have nothing against science. I just don't think it's adequate. And I have questions that are simply not scientific questions. So what? I mean, hello. And what I can tell you about scientists, this is a joke of mine. All scientists, it turns out, are also human beings. And by that, I mean it's a joke, but it's also like there's something else going on in them
Yeah.
that a lot of them understand perfectly well, is also real, is also part of our reality. And a lot of scientists are very open-minded. And when it comes to these, I mean, Alex is a perfect example. He's a physicist, but he's also talking to us. He's like trying to integrate this into his science. And maybe it can't be. I'm not presuming that a precognitive dream can be integrated into quantum physics. I'm not presuming that. But there is something about quantum physics that's really interesting. It provides a new set of metaphors that I think are interesting. And I think what's happening with scientism is it's basically Newtonian, Pavel. It's basically we're thinking about the world as a set of separate objects and bouncing around in some kind of neutral space, you know, and time is linear. And, it's very Isaac Newton. And that works. That totally works. We can get to a person to the moon and back with that physics. But it is not true of this deeper reality that we now call quantum reality. It's simply not true.
Yeah.
We know that reality deep down is probabilistic and it involves observation. It's probably non-local or it's not even real in some idealist sense. We know this from our quantum physics, but we actually don't know that. We don't know what is true about it, but we know it doesn't work anything like this Newtonian world up here. And
Yeah.
I think what is happening in this paradigm shift, and by the way, I don't like the language of disclosure. I don't like it because I think disclosure has always been happening. Uh, by the way, disclosure just means apocalypse. Apocalypse means disclosure, literally. Greek.
Revelation, right?
Well, apocalypse means an uncovering. It literally means you're taking the lid off something. And disclosure to me it's kind of a ho-hum, to be quite honest. I mean, there's nothing in the abduction community or the UFO world that surprises me in the least. It's all there, including encounters with entities. Although sometimes I am challenged, it's much more physical, much more um, material than I sometimes talk, but I understand that too.
Yeah.
And the same is true of these historical encounters. So I think human beings have been engaging with entities coming out of the wall or from the sky for thousands of years, maybe millions of years. And I don't think disclosure is going to happen tomorrow or next year because it's already happened. It's called
Yeah.
it's called religion.
Yeah, and I guess because, for example, Alex had an NDE, and
Yeah.
had he not experienced that, maybe his worldview would be very different. You
It
know?
would. It would, of
Yeah.
course, it'd be different. That's what
Yeah.
I call the flip, by the way. It's when a scientist or an engineer or a medical professional, somebody trained in a materialist worldview, has an NDE or has a psychedelic experience, or they do something and they flip. They realize in a very personal, direct way that consciousness or mind is not a product of the brain,
Yeah.
and that it's somehow primary in the universe.
I guess at the end of the day, there's a lot of people that are very skeptical that just need to see something, to believe.
They're skeptical because they're rooted in this Newtonian worldview. And I understand that. That's why they're skeptical. They're being honest. Well,
Yeah.
I don't attribute dishonesty or insincerity to anyone, including these skeptics. I think they're being completely honest, but it still doesn't work. It's still that's my problem with it. It really comes down to human experience and whether basically what I want to know, and I don't think I'll ever know this, but basically what I want us to know is, what does the universe have to look like for these sorts of things to happen?
Yeah.
Because they clearly happen. They clearly happen. So
Yeah.
your magic mushroom spoke to you about a universal language. Okay, that happened. What does that mean? What does it mean about space and time and energy and cosmology and all of these things? What does it mean? And so to have a conversation about that is part of this process that, and I don't know where that ends or where that concludes. I really don't.
Yeah. At Rice, there is this project that I really, really want to know more about called the Archives of the Impossible.
Right.
And I spoke to Mr. Darren King,
Yeah.
that he's collaborating a little bit with you on some
Yeah.
of that. What are the Archives of the Impossible, and what is necessary to get somebody's work in there? If
Yeah. So the Archives of the Impossible is about 16 collections of life works of human beings. They range from everything from Jacques Vallée, to remote viewing, to graphic novels, to physical mediums, people who can manipulate physical objects. I mean, they range through a lot of things. We don't have any criteria about what has to be there, other than it has to be impossible in the context of this scientific or materialist framework that we're talking about. I don't think impossibility is a function of the phenomena. I think it's a function of our worldview.
yeah,
In other words, it's what we say is impossible. It's not actually impossible. And so these archives, to go back to the archives, there's a physical archival collection in a place called the Woodson Research Center at Rice University. Um, it probably consists of 750,000 to 1 million documents and files and
whoa,
videos. I
whoa,
mean, it's huge. No, it's huge, Pavel. Um, Far bigger than any human being can ever get through. Uh, but,
wow,
but but any researcher can come to the Woodson Research Center and request to see particular archival collections that are not on moratorium. By the way, some of the donors demanded moratorium, so we can't hand those out for a particular number of years. But others of them are open to the public and perfectly accessible. Um, and the motivation for that archive on my end now is to make this multi-generational.
yeah,
I want and I want to mainstream it. And by that I mean I want it to be a part of a university, part of history, part of literature, part of science, part of physics and chemistry and genetics and philosophy. I want people from all kinds of disciplines to be able to come and research into these materials and try to figure out, A, what happened, but B, what it means. Uh, I think that's really the goal of the archives. And we host conferences around them, Pablo. We have one coming up April 3rd to the 5th on the UFO, by the way, the UFO and the impossible. Um, we try to create a community of conversation around them. It's very much like the Soul Foundation in San Francisco around Gary Nolan, but it's more on the weird kind of experiencer spectrum. We're not so much looking at the science or the public policy of it. We're looking at the experiencer element. The what does this look like if we look at human beings who have had these experiences? That's but not entirely. There's a lot of science in the archives as well. A lot of physics, particularly.
Yeah. Has because when I had my psychedelic decades long journey, I experienced some things that I still cannot explain to this day. And I stumbled upon a scientist who's Mexican, whose name is Jacobo Greenberg. Have you ever heard of him?
No, I haven't.
No. Alex talks a lot about him too. And well, his work spans through like 3 decades, and he's like the only scientist who really studied shamans for
Uh-huh.
about 2 decades. He studied
Yeah.
Pachita,
Yeah.
who Puharich also studied her. And I don't know, maybe we could talk like I could send you some stuff about him so you can find out more. I think his work is really important. He founded the Mexican Institute of Consciousness, and I don't know, maybe his work fits somewhere in there if possible.
Yeah, we certainly don't have there's a lot of French stuff in the files, by the way, but not very little Spanish material. I mean, Salvador Frexido is somebody
They
that,
were friends, actually.
yeah, that's somebody who appears quite often in the archives. And I've read Frexido's work that's been translated into English, which is very John Keel-like.
Yeah.
It's very John Keelish. But so there's what I'm trying to say is there's no cultural requirement for the archives. There's no linguistic requirement. We've just started. I mean, this is only 5, 6 years old. We're just getting going. And in terms of what can be archived, it just depends. Every collection we accept represents hundreds of hours of labor for
Yep.
archivists, and then climate controlled storage as well. And so we have to be really careful about what we accept and what we don't.
If you ever need any help, I'm more than happy to help.
That's what a lot of people say. The problem with that is help requires management. I mean, we gotta tell people what to do, or not tell them. We have to show them what to do, and we don't have the labor or the staff, Pavel. I mean, I that sounds pathetic, but it's simply true. It's simply true. And I'm a mortal being. I'm finite. I'll, disappear in a few years. And what then? So that's why an archive is so important to me, because
Yeah,
it doesn't require a particular person to be there.
I agree. You still live on for many, many generations. I do know that.
Okay. All right.
Just one final thing before we leave. I wanted to ask you about your experiences.
Yeah.
Anything you would like to share that you've experienced that is anomalous, if any?
So there was a recent series on MGM Plus called Beyond, and they recreate my experience, and it's done really well. I got to say that's good. It makes me way cooler than I actually am, Pavel. Um, but that's okay. The event actually occurred in 1989, and I was studying in what was then called Calcutta, or now Kolkata, and it was during Kali Puja, so it was like a 3 or 4 day puja event with all these pandals, or temporary statues and temples in the city. And I went to bed one night, and I woke up, but my body did not. Kind of a classic sleep paralysis experience, and I experienced this profound energy, that I thought originally it had come out of the wall. I was being electrocuted, but it might have come out of my body, it might have come out of me, it might have come out of somewhere else, but it was interacting with me in a very physical, very obvious way. This was not a dream. This was something was going on in a very powerful way, and it then imploded inside my chest, and I felt myself leaving my body and had a kind of classical out of body experience or near death experience. And then I came back into my body and I just felt like something had been downloaded or transmitted into me. And I then wrote a bunch of books. I mean, over the last 35 years or whatever it is. I mean, I've written a lot of books and a lot of essays, and I really do think that they somehow go back to that event. I don't know how, I don't know why, but that was totally anomalous, Pavel. That it just blew the socks off of a lot of my materialist training, and it made me a different kind of writer and a different kind of thinker that I try to be true to this day.
That's wild. Um, so many similarities with some of the things that happened to me.
I know
It's
it could totally have been psychedelic. I mean, I wasn't on any psychedelic, by the way, but it has all the qualities. It also looked a lot. It felt a lot like an abduction experience, by the way. But there was no visual component. I didn't see a lady or an alien or have any of the sort of things that visionaries talk about. But it was definitely like that. I mean,
did you feel did
I
you
didn't
feel
have
any
that.
fear?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
I thought I was dying.
Oh my God, that's horrible.
No, well, is it? I mean, I don't.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah. I mean, not a bad way to go. And um, I don't take fear as a bad thing. Is what I'm trying to say. I don't see. And goes back to the demonic language. I fear and negativity. Doesn't mean to me something bad. It's a human response. You know.
Okay. I guess since I heard the telepathy tapes, that fear of dying kind of has been disappearing because that was a really eye-opening for me, and it yeah, I love that. We can talk about that on the next if we get a chance to talk again,
Sure.
which I would
Sure.
absolutely love.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for your time, Professor, and yeah, well, just one final thought. What would you, from my friend Ali at Living Life Consciously, what's your biggest hope for humanity?
The hope for humanity. Is that what you said?
What's your biggest hope for humanity?
Um, that we get beyond our exclusivisms, that we think we're somehow separate. I hope we can get beyond thinking in terms of essences, that there's something called America and there's something called Mexico and Canada and Gaza and Israel and all of these things. There's something else that joins us, that connects us. And I want us to like understand that and foreground it in our political and moral talk as well. That's my biggest hope, is we understand that we're a single species and not a collection of nation states or religions.
Again, going back to that universal language. I told you.
It's very much in that zone.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I do what I do. That sounds naive and maybe utopian, but I'm essentially an optimist about about the future, certainly about human beings.
Same.
I know they do really horrible things and are really not so good very often.
Well, thank you, sir. And I'll see you around. I hope we can do this again soon. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure, Pablo.
Thank you guys. Have a good one.
Bye.
Take care.